Kelsey Dion, the creator of the Shadowdark RPG, said that this new adventure blew her away, and she's not the only one. Hey folks, I'm William, this is Runeforged, welcome to the channel. Today we're taking a look at a brand new Shadowdark zine called the Righteous Vow Volume 1 by Bill Harvat and his team over at Crawl Club. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video where I give my final thoughts on the adventure overall, including the gravest sin any adventure could ever commit. Not really, but it's fun to talk about. So what is the Righteous Vow? Well, it's a brand new Shadowdark zine/adventure for characters of levels 1 to 5. Here's the premise. Long ago, the evil sorcerer king Zardu ruled over the local region with an iron fist. Eventually, his denizens rose up in revolt. Zardu was defeated, sealed alive within his tomb, and left there to rot. But to this day, the land remains beset by all manner of foul undead creatures from the time of Zardu's reign. When our heroes arrive in town, a dispossessed noble comes seeking assistance in reclaiming his ancestral home that was long ago overrun by Zardu's undead minions. In exchange, the noble says that the heroes can keep all of the gold and treasure that they find, including the immense wealth that must surely be buried in the tomb of King Zardu himself, if it can be found. Will our heroes discover the truth of King Zardu's downfall and claim his long-lost treasures? Or will they be overwhelmed by the near-endless hordes of undead that continue to plague this accursed land? Well, there's only one way to find out. In typical Shadowdark fashion, this is very much a classic dungeon crawly type of adventure with a bit of hex crawling thrown in for good measure. Essentially, the adventure boils down to a moderately sized overland area with 7 major points of interest scattered across the map. Most of these being the haunted fortresses left behind after King Zardu's reign. Each of the fortresses includes a small to medium-sized dungeon, or about 10 rooms on average. And typically, a deadly boss battle awaits you at the end of each dungeon. Speaking of which, if you are enjoying this video, please consider aiding me in my battle against the greatest boss of them all, the YouTube algorithm, by crushing those like and subscribe buttons so you don't miss out on more awesome adventure spotlights like this in the future. All right, let's talk a little bit about what's included in the adventure. The adventure itself is 72 pages long and includes a hex map and key for the surrounding area, including relevant rumor and random encounter tables, 9 new monsters, mostly various different types of skeletal opponents, 7 new magical items, and of course, GM-facing info and maps for the 7 dungeon locations included in the adventure. Then, in separate files that also come with the adventure, you also get player-facing maps for each of those 7 dungeons, and each of the maps has 2 different variants, both a black and white and a color version, except for the hex map, which only comes in black and white. And I have to say that these are some really nice-looking maps. I don't have anything at all against the Dyson logo maps. I think those are great maps in their own right, but I do feel like you see them in Shadowdark adventures pretty much all the time, and a lot of times you'll see the same ones across multiple different adventures. And I just really appreciate that these maps were custom made specifically for this adventure. And I think the fact that they included both color and black and white maps is really just above and beyond. And I hope we see more creators do this in the future. And that leads us really nicely into our next section, which is, what did I like about the Righteous Vow, other than the awesome maps? I mean, I think I have to talk about that classic trio of components, setting, theme, and art. You know, this adventure is very much like classic dungeon crawling fantasy with a heavy emphasis on skeletal and other undead enemies. And I have to say that I absolutely love that, and that is right up my alley. And of course, there's some absolutely spectacular art to go with it, which of course I've been showcasing and will continue to showcase throughout the rest of the video. Overall, just some very high quality stuff. The adventure also has a very clean and very professional looking layout. Wisely, I think it very closely mirrors the official Shadowdark content. After all, if it's not broke, why fix it? And as I was reading through it, I only noticed 1 or 2 typos, which is exceedingly rare for third-party Shadowdark material. Also, I found it really easy to read and comprehend what was going on in the adventure. Normally, when I'm reading through an adventure, I can usually only get through about 50 pages in one sitting, but I was able to breeze through this 70-plus page document with no issues whatsoever, which I think is a really strong testament to the document's readability. I know a lot of people probably consider this pretty minor, but it's actually a huge positive for me personally. As often if I find myself struggling through read through an adventure, the chances of me running it go down significantly. I also really enjoyed like the overall structure of this adventure, largely due to how reasonably sized the dungeons are and how close together the points of interest are. I think you could probably pretty easily get through one or maybe even 2 points of interest in each session and be able to stop each session at a very natural ending point, which is something that I very much appreciate. Also, I really love the fact that this adventure has like proper boss fights at the end of most of the dungeons. And the last fight in particular looks like it's going to be a ton of fun to run, if perhaps a little bit brutal for the players themselves. Let's just say they better come prepared or they won't be making it out alive. So what are the things that I didn't like as much about this adventure? I think that maybe my biggest complaint about the adventure overall is it does seem like there's a little bit of lack of variety in terms of both locations and monster types. Contributing to this is the fact that all of the dungeons use the same random encounter table. So aside from a few unique monsters that you'll find in any given dungeon, you're mostly going to be fighting a couple different versions of skeletal enemies. Now, I do want to say this is really not that big of a deal for me personally. I'm perfectly fine both running around smashing classic undead enemies. But I do think there are probably people out there that are going to want a little bit more variety in the monster types that they are going up against. Also, while I found that the adventure was pretty easy to read through overall, there were a couple of points that tripped me up during my first read through. For example, there is a mechanic that allows you to essentially randomize the location of Zardew's castle. And at first I found the wording to be a little bit confusing because in that section of the book, they refer to the fortresses as manors, which is a different word from how they refer to them throughout the rest of the book. So at first I was very much confused about what these manors were and what relation they had to the fortresses that are the main focus of the adventure. Turns out they're the same thing. They just decided to use a different word in that section of the book. But more than that, I just don't know if the randomization mechanic is even necessary. I actually think that the default locations for the various different fortresses is actually right on point, and I think it makes the most sense from both a structural and narrative perspective. I don't want to get too deep into spoilers, but at one point there is a very natural progression where you will pretty much be forced to choose between 2 equidistant fortifications. And the order in which you explore those fortresses could have a pretty profound impact on the rest of the game, which I do think is a very cool and interesting dynamic. And finally, I don't know if knowing the location of Zardew's castle is really that big of a deal. The issue isn't really with finding the castle, it's more about making sure that you are properly leveled and equipped to deal with the challenges that you are going to find in the final location. And in order to make sure that you are prepared, you're probably just going to have to go through all of the other dungeons anyway. So overall, while I do think it's an interesting idea and it may help replayability if you decide to play through the adventure multiple times, I just don't know if it's adding enough value to justify its inclusion. But I'd be curious to know if anybody has a different perspective on this. If so, just let me know down in the comments. But one way or another, really not that big of a deal. But you know what is a big deal? Literally the most terrible adventure writing sin of all time. Not using the standard 6-mile hex. Yes, that's right. This adventure uses the strictly inferior 5-mile hex. I know. I couldn't believe it either. It was all going so well right up until I saw that. Obviously, I'm just kidding. While Shadowdark does make use of a standard 6-mile hex, and if you decided to use a 5-mile hex, you'd have to do some additional calculations. I've actually found this really simple fix. I'm just going to pretend like they're 6-mile hexes and not 5-mile hexes, and we just won't tell Bill. All right, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, what are my overall thoughts on the adventure? Well, aside from a few minor quibbles, and I do mean very minor, I think this is a really awesome adventure. I don't think it necessarily does anything new per se, but it's just a very solid, well-produced adventure and a really fantastic first showing for Bill and his team over at Crawl Club Publishing. And if you don't want to take my word for it, here's what Kelsey Dion, the creator of Shadowdark, had to say about this adventure. Just downloaded it and I'm blown away. The art alone is incredible, but also I'm really enjoying reading it too. A very worthy zine. And if that's not a glowing endorsement, I don't know what is. So if you'd like to pick up a copy of Righteous Vow Volume 1 for yourself, there is a link to do so down in the description. And if you've enjoyed this video, I have several other Shadowdark adventure reviews, which should be popping up on your screen right about now. So definitely check those out if you're so inclined. But I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day. Bye.